In the middle of a deadly snowstorm, when the Capitol dome vanished beneath a sea of ice and wind, 50,000 American jobs balanced on the edge of a single vote. Inside that vast cold chamber, nearly empty, nearly silent, J.D. Vance stood alone, his breath visible in the freezing air, his heart heavy with the weight of families he'd never met. Across from him, Elizabeth Warren, fierce and unyielding, defended caution, procedure, the letter of the law. But J.D. fought for the spirit of the nation. His voice rose above the howl of the storm outside, above the fear inside. And then, a sound that would haunt every person in that room. A mother's cry, soft at first, then breaking, shattering the chamber's cold decorum. One cry that turned debate into reckoning. One tear that changed history. What happened next left America in tears. And as you hear this story tonight, I invite you to ask yourself, would you have had the courage to stand as he did? While this story draws upon real figures and real struggles, what follows is a dramatization, shaped not to report, but to reflect. It is crafted to honor the emotions, hopes, and hard choices that bind us as a people, reminding us of what truly matters in moments that test the soul of a nation. Join us now and see why one night, one cry, and one man's courage could inspire a nation. The storm was unlike anything the Capitol had seen in decades. Snow fell not in flakes, but in thick, blinding sheets. A white wall that erased streets, swallowed landmarks, and buried history beneath its weight. The great dome of the Capitol, usually a beacon against the night sky, was nothing more than a ghostly outline, barely visible through the icy veil. The storm was relentless. It howled through the narrow streets of Washington like a living thing, tearing at flags, rattling windows, and seeping through the very bones of the city. Midnight had come, and with it a cold that felt ancient, as if it had risen from the deepest corners of the earth to test the resolve of men. Inside warm homes, lights flickered as the power grid groaned beneath the storm's fury. But within the Capitol itself, a different battle was about to begin, one that no storm could smother. The American Workers' Relief Act lay before the Senate, a lifeline for 50,000 families whose jobs had disappeared with the collapse of the mills and factories that once fed the nation's strength. A bill long delayed by debate, by politics, by fear, now demanded action. The country waited, breath held, as the storm outside mirrored the storm within. And through that storm, a solitary figure pressed forward. J.D. Vance, coat drawn tight against the wind's bite, head lowered, boots crunching over snow that reached halfway up his calves. Every step toward the Capitol felt heavier than the last, not just from the drifts that blocked his path, but from the invisible weight he carried, the letters he'd read from desperate fathers, the phone calls from mothers begging for mercy, the faces of workers he'd met, men and women who had given everything to a country that now seemed to have forgotten them. Each gust of wind stung like betrayal. Each flurry of snow whispered the voices of the abandoned. Do something, JDD. The Capitol loomed ahead, a citadel under siege by nature itself. Its grand columns iced over, steps buried, the dome's once proud gleam reduced to a dull frozen crown. JD paused for a moment at the foot of those steps, chest heaving from the fight against the storm. He stared up at that dome and felt, in his bones, the weight of what tonight would mean. This storm is not the only one we face, he thought, and not the most dangerous. Inside, he knew, the chamber would be half empty, some too afraid, some too tired, some unwilling to risk the journey. And perhaps that, he mused bitterly, was the true metaphor of the storm. A nation paralyzed, leadership frozen, the people left out in the cold. But why had JD come when so many had stayed away? Was it duty? Was it anger? Was it hope? The truth, perhaps, was all three, and something more, a promise he'd made to himself long ago, in a house where the roof leaked and the cupboards were bare, that if ever he found himself in a place to help, he would not look away, not tonight, not ever. Above him, the wind screamed through the scaffolding of a long-stalled renovation on the Capitol's east wing, as if mocking the nation's delay. JD clenched his fists in his pockets and began the climb, his boots crunching against ice-covered stone, his breath ragged clouds in the bitter air. And somewhere deep inside that chamber, the debate had already begun. Whispers of caution, echoes of fear. JD knew what awaited him. Resistance, hesitation, arguments wrapped in the language of reason, but born of cowardice. He felt it coming, like the next blast of Arctic air. But he also knew something else, that tonight something would break, the storm outside or the storm within. And as he reached the great doors and pushed them open, J.D. Vance stepped into history and into a night that America would never forget. The heavy doors groaned shut behind J.D., sealing out the storm's fury but not its memory. Inside the Capitol's great chamber, the air felt just as cold, the marble walls offering no comfort against the night's chill. The storm's howl, now muffled, seemed to haunt the hall, a ghostly reminder of the world outside. J.D. paused for a moment at the threshold, his boots leaving a trail of melted snow on polished stone. The emptiness struck him first. Rows of seats stood like forgotten monuments, many abandoned for the night by those unwilling or unable to face the storm or the vote. Only a scattering of senators remained, their faces pale in the flickering light of emergency lamps. Shadows danced along the high ceilings, giving the room a cavernous, almost sacred feel, as if this chamber now bore witness not just to policy, but to the soul of the nation in crisis. J.D. moved forward, each footstep echoing louder than it should have in the vast, hollow space. He removed his gloves, flexing fingers, stiff from cold, and took his seat with a slow, deliberate motion. Across the chamber, his eyes met those of Elizabeth Warren. The two locked gazes. No words exchanged, no need. The tension between them filled the silence more powerfully than any debate yet spoken. Warren sat upright, her hands folded before her expression a blend of resolve and wariness. J.D. saw in her the weight of responsibility, but also the hesitations of one who measured risk in increments, who preferred certainty before action. And he knew in that instant that the real storm tonight was not of snow and ice, but of wills and convictions about to collide. He rose first, his voice steady, but carrying a raw edge that matched the night's harshness. While we speak here, there are families huddled in dark homes, waiting for heat, waiting for food, waiting for us to stop debating and start saving lives. His words rang through the chamber, bouncing off cold stone, reaching even those who had tried to retreat into the shadows of indecision. The room was still. Then Warren stood, her voice measured, even soothing, a stark contrast to J.D.'s urgency. We all feel the weight of this crisis, but haste can lead to harm. The bill, as written, has gaps. If we act without care, we could waste resources or deepen inequality. We must be cautious, thoughtful. Her words, reasonable on the surface, landed like frost on already frozen hearts. J.D. felt it, the subtle pull of procedure over passion, the old familiar comfort of delay dressed as prudence. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself, knowing the argument would not be won with speeches alone, but with the truth of what could no longer wait. Outside, the wind rose again, a low, mournful sound that seemed to seep through the very stone. It was as if the storm itself demanded resolution. Inside, the chamber remained divided, not yet by votes, but by fear and courage, by caution and conviction. J.D.'s hands rested on the desk before him, knuckles white as he prepared to answer. And as his voice began to rise once more, the storm outside seemed to still, as if pausing to listen to what would come next. The chamber held its breath, as if the storm outside had indeed paused to hear what would unfold. J.D. gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white against the polished wood, and slowly pushed himself to his feet. The silence was thick, every eye turning to him now. Some with curiosity, some with fatigue, others with quiet dread at the battle about to begin. The great dome above seemed to listen too, its shadow heavy over the scene, as if history itself leaned closer. J.D.'s voice, when it came, was low at first, but clear. We stand here tonight, wrapped in words, while their homes go dark. He let the weight of the sentence settle before he spoke again, his tone gathering strength like the storm outside. We balance phrases and paragraphs while their children sleep cold. Every minute we waste debating is another minute of hunger, another hour without heat. Are we leaders or are we authors of their misery? His eyes swept the chamber, challenging, pleading, unflinching. For a moment, no one spoke. The truth of it was as sharp as the wind beyond these walls. JD's words echoed off marble and heart alike, too raw to dismiss. But then came the inevitable counterpoint, steady and practiced. Warren rose, composed, her voice smooth as a lawyer's but not without feeling. She met JD's gaze with one of her own, firm yet sorrowful, as if willing him to understand the weight of caution. Senator Vance, none of us wishes delay. None of us is blind to suffering. But if we rush, we risk disaster. The bill as it stands could fail the very people we seek to help. There are provisions unvetted, clauses that could open doors for waste or worse. We must act, but we must act wisely. Her words were like a cold rain against JD's fire, dampening but not extinguishing. The chamber seemed to shiver under the tension, the clash of passion and prudence. Outside, the storm found its voice again, a rising wail that seeped through stone and wood, mirroring the struggle inside. Nature's fury against man's indecision. JD did not sit. He stood steady, the weight of Warren's words acknowledged but not accepted. Wisdom without action is as cruel as ignorance, he said quietly. And tonight, wisdom means seeing what delay will cost. Those gaps in the bill, we can fill them tomorrow, but the gaps in their lives, the heat, the food, the shelter, we must fill those tonight. Warren did not flinch, but her fingers tightened where they rested on the desk. The divide was no longer abstract. It had a face. JD's, carved in resolve, and hers shaped by the burden of responsibility she felt could not be rushed. Around them, the chamber felt smaller, as if drawn in by the force of their words. The storm lashed harder against the windows, as if the very elements demanded resolution. But inside, the true storm was this: courage against caution, urgency against order. And as JD's gaze swept the chamber one last time before yielding the floor, he knew the battle lines had been drawn. The storm's howl beyond the chamber grew louder still, as if nature itself strained to hear what would come next. Inside, the cold air seemed thicker now, charged with the weight of the words just spoken. JD Vance remained standing, his hands braced on the desk before him, as if steadying himself not only against the storm, but against the tide of resistance rising within the room. He inhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch a moment longer, before speaking again, his voice measured but fierce, each word struck like a hammer upon iron. "Picture them tonight," JD began, his eyes sweeping the chamber, not just addressing his colleagues, but daring them to look away. Children lying beneath threadbare blankets in rooms gone dark, parents sitting awake, afraid to close their eyes, afraid of what tomorrow won't bring. We're here, wrapped in wool and stone, and they're out there, wrapped in worry and cold. He stepped away from the desk, his boots echoing in the vast space, his voice gaining force with each stride. We debate as if they have time. We balance numbers as if a decimal point feeds a child. They're on the brink tonight, not next week, not after we finish fine-tuning a bill. Now, the chamber remained still, but JD could feel the unease growing like a tremor beneath the polished floor. A few senators shifted in their seats, eyes lowered, unwilling to meet his gaze. Others watched intently, their expressions masked, but their hearts perhaps, stirring in ways they wouldn't yet admit. But then Warren rose again, calm and collected, her posture straight as a blade, her voice as steady as the marble columns that surrounded them. She spoke not to challenge JD's emotion, but to ground it in what she believed was duty. No one here denies the urgency, but we have an obligation to make sure the help we offer doesn't become harm. This bill, as written, contains loopholes that could cost us billions. Billions that might never reach the families you speak of so powerfully, Senator Vance. Her words fell like cold rain on fire, deliberate and precise. She drew from the pages before her, citing sections, naming clauses, referencing reports that warned of fraud, waste, unintended consequences. Her tone was not dismissive but firm. shaped by years of battles fought in the arena of policy rather than the heart. If we pass this in haste, we risk enriching those who would exploit our goodwill. We risk failing not just those who suffer tonight, but those who will suffer when the money's gone and the need remains. JD listened, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving hers. He heard the logic but felt the fear behind it. Fear of mistakes, fear of blame, fear of stepping wrong in a storm where there were no dry paths. The chamber itself seemed to absorb their words, the marble walls holding them like secrets too heavy to release. A low murmur began among the senators, voices soft but rising like wind through dry leaves. JD could feel it, the divide deepening. Not just between him and Warren, but through the very heart of the chamber. Those who leaned toward swift action, and those who clung to caution like a lifeline. The storm outside raged on, but the real tempest was here, beneath the dome, where the fate of thousands balanced on words, courage, and the fear of what might follow. The murmur within the chamber faded, as if the storm itself had drawn it away, leaving behind a stillness heavy with expectation. JD's gaze lifted, drawn upward toward the gallery that overlooked the Senate floor, that quiet perch where the real weight of the night seemed to gather. Though no camera filmed it, no broadcast shared it, in that moment the gallery was the truest mirror of the nation's soul. Up there in the dim light, faces watched with a hope so fragile it seemed the very air might shatter it. Single mothers wrapped in worn coats, hands clasped tight as if in prayer. Veterans, their shoulders squared but their eyes hollow, haunted by battles both abroad and at home. Men and women whose calloused hands had once built the engines of the nation's strength, now idle, trembling, uncertain. JD let his eyes rest on them, drawing strength and sorrow in equal measure. His voice faltered for a heartbeat as he took them in, as if their presence alone carried more weight than any argument he could offer. And then among them, his eyes found her. The mother who would haunt him long after this night had passed. She sat near the center of the gallery, a small woman in a faded wool scarf, hands gripping a creased photograph that caught the light when she shifted. The image was blurred by time, but clear enough. A man in work overalls, a warm smile, strong arms folded across his chest. Her late husband, JD, knew without needing to be told. Lost, as he would later learn, to an industrial accident in a factory now shuttered, its gates locked, its machines silent. Her eyes met JD's for the briefest moment, and in them he saw no anger, no blame, only the quiet, enduring pain of one who had been waiting too long for promises to become action. Her gaze did not plead, but it did not look away. It simply held his, and with it reminded him why he had braved the storm, why he could not yield to caution or delay. The chamber seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in, the arguments below ringing hollow against the truth written in those faces above. JD felt it, as did others. He saw senators glancing toward the gallery, saw them shift uncomfortably under the silent judgment of those who had no vote, no voice in this room, only the right to watch and hope. Warren, too, lifted her eyes, and though her words still rested on caution, her face softened, her breath catching as she took in the quiet rows of witnesses. The divide between them, between passion and prudence, remained, but for a moment, even she could feel how thin that line was when weighed against the cost of delay. The storm outside lashed at the Capitol, rattling ancient windows and filling the chamber with its mournful wail. Inside, the true storm, the one of hearts and minds, swirled beneath marble and gold. And as JD lowered his gaze from the gallery, the weight of those faces upon him, he knew his next words would have to rise above fear, above reasoned delay. They would have to carry the fire of those who could no longer speak for themselves. The chamber seemed frozen in time, the faces in the gallery still etched in JD's mind as he lowered his gaze, his breath shallow from the weight of all he carried. The storm's mournful song rattled the high windows, filling the silences between heartbeats with a sound that felt too much like grief. And for a long moment, JD simply stood there, the words he needed refusing to come, as if language itself faltered in the face of such quiet desperation. But then, when the room could hold no more stillness, When the air grew so heavy with expectation that it seemed no one dared even breathe, JD found his voice, though when it came, it trembled with the rawness of what was at stake. They trusted us. The words were soft at first, but carried to every corner of the chamber, as if the stone itself bore witness. He paused, his throat tight, his eyes shining not with defiance but with sorrow. They trusted us with their hopes, their futures, their families. And tonight, we either honor that trust or betray it. The final phrase echoed in the chamber like a verdict, heavier than any vote, sharper than any law. JD's voice cracked on the last word, the truth of it too large to contain. And as he stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, the room seemed smaller, the great hall no longer a place of politics, but of reckoning. No one moved at first. Even those most hardened by years of procedure felt the shift, the subtle, seismic crack in the wall between debate and duty. It was Warren who rose, slowly, thoughtfully, her face pale against the dark wood behind her. She took a breath as if to steady herself, her hands resting lightly on the desk, the weight of her own conscience not absent from her gaze. "Senator Vance," she began, her voice even but not unfeeling, "we all feel this burden. We all wish we could act with the certainty your words demand. But law is not built on wishes, nor can compassion alone guide us through the storm. If we move too quickly, we may do harm where we mean to heal. We may open doors that can't be closed, create holes that can't be filled. That is not betrayal. That is responsibility." Her words filled the chamber, deliberate and clear, the voice of reason in a room drowning in passion. Yet even as she spoke, even as her logic carved paths through the emotion that JD's plea had stirred, the chamber felt changed, as though the very walls had absorbed the truth JD had laid bare, and would not let it be forgotten. The storm outside beat harder against the windows, the wind's howl mingling with the last notes of Warren's reply. Inside, the divide had not narrowed, but the ground beneath them had shifted. Every senator could feel it, that tonight was no longer about procedure or even politics. Tonight was about the question JD had given voice to, and the answer each would have to live with when the storm was gone. And as the chamber fell quiet once more, all eyes turned to JD, waiting for the next strike in this battle of heart and mind, as the storm beyond the walls refused to relent. The chamber held its breath, the echoes of Warren's words still suspended in the cold air like mist. JD stood motionless, hands resting on the desk before him, his heart pounding loud enough that he imagined others might hear it. The storm's howl beyond the marble walls softened for a moment, as if nature itself leaned closer to listen to what might come next. And just as JD drew breath to speak again, as if the weight of the night demanded one more plea, a sound rose from the gallery that silenced every thought, every intention, every practiced speech. It began softly as though carried on the storm's breath, a broken sob, raw and real, unguarded, a sound that cut through the cold air of the chamber like a bell tolling for the forgotten. The sob came again, fuller now, impossible to ignore, filling the vast space with the kind of grief no law, no caution, no debate could contain. JD froze, his words lost on his tongue, his head lifted, his eyes drawn as if by unseen hands toward the gallery above. There, in the dim light that bled through the high windows, he saw her, the woman with the faded scarf, the one whose eyes had met his before. Her shoulders shook as the sobs overtook her. One trembling hand pressed over her mouth as if trying, failing, to dam the flood of sorrow that had broken loose. The other hand clutched that worn photograph still, its corners bent, its image now blurred by falling tears. The room froze with him. Senators who moments before had whispered strategies, weighed numbers, or clung to their notes now sat in stunned silence, as if the cry had stripped away the layers of procedure and left only what mattered. The mother's grief echoed from stone to stone, filling spaces that no words had ever reached. JD's chest tightened, the weight of her pain heavier than any argument he could offer. His throat burned, his vision blurred, not from the cold, but from the swell of helplessness and fury that this cry, this truth, ignited within him. The storm outside battered the windows, But it was this storm, this woman's sorrow that shook the chamber to its core. For what felt like endless seconds, no one moved. Even Warren's face had changed, her composure fractured, her eyes glistening as they rose to the gallery, as if the mother's anguish reached across the space between caution and conviction. The chamber's great dome seemed to shrink, drawing all within it closer to the raw humanity of this moment. JD found his voice, but it was softer now, reverent, as if afraid to overshadow the cry that had spoken so much without words. "Let her cry," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "That cry is America tonight." No senator answered. No rebuttal came. The only sound was the storm and the mother's quiet sobs, still echoing, still reminding them all of what was at stake. And as the chamber remained still, every heart beat to the rhythm of that grief, every mind forced to face what politics had tried to hide. In that moment, the divide in the chamber was no longer drawn in arguments or amendments. It was drawn in whether one could hear that cry, truly hear it, and still choose delay. And JD knew, as his gaze remained fixed on her, that the night had changed. The chamber seemed suspended in time, as if the storm outside and the storm within had merged into one great trembling breath that neither dared exhale. The mother's sobs, though quieter now, still echoed in every corner of the great hall, as if the walls themselves carried the sound, unwilling to let it die. And there stood JD, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the gallery, on the figure whose grief had spoken louder than all their arguments combined. He could feel the eyes of the chamber upon him, waiting, weighing. This was not the speech he had planned. This was not the strategy he had prepared. But it was the moment the night had demanded. Raw, unvarnished, true. His voice, when it came, carried that same truth, stripped of polish, stripped of fear. "Let her cry." The words, though soft, seemed to fill the room, silencing even the faintest whisper. "That is the voice of America tonight." He turned slowly, sweeping his eyes across the chamber, meeting gaze after gaze, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a quiet, burning certainty. That voice isn't noise. It isn't weakness. It's the sound of promises broken, of lives on the edge. And we sit here, wrapped in protocol, while that voice asks us one thing. Will we listen? The storm's howl surged once more, rattling the ancient glass, as if in answer. JD let it fill the silence. Let it remind them that outside these walls the world waited, watched, and needed. His heart pounded so loud in his chest that it seemed part of the storm itself. He drew a breath, steadying himself, knowing that this was not just a speech. This was the stand that would mark this night forever. Around him, senators shifted in their seats. Some lowered their eyes, unable or unwilling to meet the weight of his words. Others stared at him, their faces caught between the demands of duty and the pull of conscience. The tension was no longer between JD and Warren, or between 2 points of policy. It was between the human heart and the chains of procedure, between compassion and the comfort of delay. Warren remained seated, her fingers interlaced tightly, her knuckles white against the polished wood of her desk. Her face, so often a mask of resolve, showed cracks now. Not weakness, but the struggle of a mind torn between logic and the undeniable truth laid bare before her. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. For once, words failed even her. JD took one last step forward, his boots clicking on the marble floor, his voice softening but losing none of its force. "Tonight, history will not remember the motions we filed or the amendments we debated. It will remember whether we heard that cry and what we did in answer." The chamber remained still, caught between the storm's fury and the quiet storm of the mother's grief, between the weight of habit and the pull of conscience. And as JD stood there, his hands at his sides, his heart bared before them all, the night seemed to hold its breath once more, waiting for who would find the courage to break the silence. The chamber remained hushed, the weight of JD's final words hanging over the room like the heavy clouds outside. The storm beyond the marble walls answered in kind, its howl rising, wind clawing at the windows as if it too demanded action. Inside, the senators sat motionless, their faces pale in the dim light. their thoughts divided between the pull of conscience and the safety of process. For a long moment, Warren did not move. She sat with her hands clenched tightly together on the desk before her eyes fixed on the dark grain of the polished wood as if searching for an answer that no paper, no policy, no prior debate could give. The storm outside seemed to find its way in, not through the stone, but through the cracks in certainty that JD's stand had opened in every heart. When Warren finally rose, it was slower than before, as though the weight of the night itself made every movement harder. She did not look at JD at first. She looked at the gallery, at the faces above who had borne silent witness, at the mother whose tears had done what hours of argument could not. And when she spoke, the strength that had marked her earlier words gave way to something more fragile, not weakness, but the tremor of emotion that no logic could wholly contain. "I hear you, Senator Vance," she said, her voice unsteady, the crack in it unmistakable. "And I hear her, and I promise you I want what you want, to help, to act, to do what is right tonight." She paused, drawing a breath that seemed to steady her only slightly. "But balance matters. We cannot afford mistakes that could haunt these same families tomorrow. There has to be a way to act with both heart and care. Please, we need balance." Her words filled the room, soft but pleading, reaching not for rebuttal, but for understanding. And for the first time that night, Warren's composure had slipped, revealing the woman beneath the senator. A woman who, like JD, carried the burdens of duty and fear of failing those who trusted her. The divide had narrowed, if only by a breath, but it was still there, caution clinging to its ground, even as conscience pulled at its edges. JD stood firm, his eyes meeting hers, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the same fierce compassion that had driven him through the storm. His voice when it came was quieter than before, but sharper, like steel drawn in the dark. "Balance doesn't feed a child tonight." The words cut through the chamber, as final and unanswerable as the storm's roar. "Balance won't warm their homes or put bread on their tables. Tomorrow we can argue balance. Tonight we must act." Outside, the wind slammed against the ancient windows, the storm reaching a new fury, as if in answer to the battle raging within these walls. The chamber felt smaller, tighter, the space between courage and caution shrinking beneath the force of what had been said, what had been felt. And as Warren lowered her gaze, her hands trembling now against the desk's edge, the room waited, as did the storm, for the decision that must follow. The chamber's stillness shattered as a senator rose from the far side of the room, his voice cutting through the charged air like a cold gust of wind slipping through a crack in the stone. The storm outside raged on, but it was this voice that now brought the greater chill. "Mr. President," the senator called, his tone formal, cautious, heavy with the practiced weight of procedure. "In light of the concerns raised this evening and the emotional nature of this debate, I move that we delay the vote until morning, to allow time for further review of the bill's provisions." The words fell like ice upon the fire JD had fought so hard to kindle. A motion, simple, legal, wrapped in the language of prudence, yet beneath its polished surface, JD heard what it truly was: an escape, a retreat behind the safety of the clock, a hope that dawn might somehow ease the burden of decision. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, soft at first, then growing like the wind outside. Senators turning to one another, some nodding as if relieved by the offer of delay, others frowning, their faces caught between duty and doubt. JD felt his pulse quicken, his breath tight in his chest. This was how courage slipped away, not with a shout, but with a motion quietly passed, the moment lost beneath layers of good intention. Before the presiding officer could acknowledge the motion, JD was already moving, his steps swift and sure, boots striking the marble floor as he crossed the space between rows of desks, leaning in close to colleagues, his voice low but urgent. "Don't do this," he said, gripping one senator's shoulder lightly, not as a demand, but as a plea. "You heard that cry. You saw what this means. Don't let the night end like this." He moved from one to the next, eyes burning with conviction. words pouring out not as speeches but as raw appeals to conscience. Every hour we wait, more go hungry. Every hour more homes grow colder. The storm won't wait. Why should we? The senators met his gaze, some with shame, some with uncertainty, some with the hard-set look of those who had already chosen the easier road. J.D. felt the storm within him rise to match the one beyond the windows, his heart pounding against the walls of his chest, his mind racing to find the words that could break through fear and fatigue. Across the chamber, Warren watched in silence, her face pale, her hands now clasped together so tightly that her knuckles gleamed white. The divide remained, but even she, J.D. saw, understood that this was the battle's edge, that what came next would mark not just the night, but the memory of all who sat within these walls. Outside, the storm howled as if to remind them that nature's fury knew no delay. Inside, J.D.'s voice wove through the chamber, not loud but relentless, a steady drumbeat of urgency against the growing weight of hesitation. And as he moved among them, urging, pleading, fighting not with force but with truth, the chamber seemed to hold its breath once more, caught between the easy path of delay and the harder road of action that waited just beyond the vote. The chamber remained on edge, the motion to delay hovering in the air like a blade not yet fallen. J.D.'s voice, so recently alive with urgency, seemed to echo in the silence that followed, its last plea hanging between marble columns and weary hearts. And just as it seemed the weight of procedure might smother what was left of courage, something shifted, not on the floor of the Senate, but above it, where the people watched. From the gallery they rose. No sound announced their protest, no chant, no cry. One by one, figures stood, faces lined with sorrow, eyes heavy with the kind of expectation that no debate could meet. Single mothers, their hands clasped in front of them as if in silent prayer. Veterans, their shoulders squared, backs straight, as though standing once more at attention, but this time for the nation's promise rather than its command. Out-of-work fathers, young adults with tired eyes, grandparents wrapped in worn coats, all of them rising quietly together until the gallery seemed to lift the chamber with the weight of their presence alone. J.D. felt the moment before he turned, the subtle shift in the air, the hush that deepened even the storm's roar beyond the windows. When his eyes found them, standing there without words, his heart clenched tight. No need for signs, no need for shouts. Their faces spoke enough. Faces lined by hard years, hollowed by worry, lit only by the fragile hope that tonight, finally, their voices would be heard through the silence. His inner voice rose above the storm of doubt in his mind, clear and certain. This isn't politics anymore. This is conscience. The thought steadied him, gave him breath, gave him strength. This was why he had come through the storm. Not for motions or amendments, not for points of order or speeches destined for the history books. For them, for those who stood now, silent, demanding with nothing but their presence what the chamber had so long delayed. Across the room, J.D. saw senators shift in their seats, glancing up at the gallery, some meeting those waiting eyes, others looking away as if unable to bear the weight of what they saw. The motion to delay no longer sounded like caution. It sounded like surrender. And still the gallery stood, unmoving, unblinking, a wall of quiet insistence that filled the chamber more powerfully than the storm's wind ever could. Warren's gaze lifted too, her face pale, her expression caught between reason and something deeper, something she had tried to guard against but could not deny. J.D. saw it in her eyes, the crack, the hesitation, the understanding that this night was no longer theirs to control. The people had claimed it, and as the presiding officer cleared his throat, preparing at last to call for the chamber's will, the storm lashed harder at the glass, as if the night itself demanded courage from those within. J.D. drew a slow breath, his heart steady now, knowing that no matter how the vote would fall, this silent protest had changed the room, changed the moment, changed them all. The chamber remained locked in that fragile stillness, the silent protest from the gallery casting a long shadow over every desk, every lawmaker. J.D. stood motionless, feeling the weight of those faces upon him, feeling too the storm's howl beyond the walls, as if nature itself demanded an answer. The motion to delay still hovered, but its strength, once so certain, now seemed to waver beneath the force of what had just unfolded. And then, from the far side of the chamber, from a place JD might have least expected, came the voice that would crack the dam. A senator from across the aisle, long known for caution and calculated words, rose slowly, his hands resting lightly on the desk before him. His face, weathered by years in the political arena, showed something rarely seen within these walls: humility and perhaps a touch of shame. He cleared his throat, his voice rough at first, then steadier. "Mr. President, I came tonight intending to vote for delay. I believed, as many here did, that more time would bring more certainty, less risk. But I have sat here, and I have listened. I have seen." His eyes lifted to the gallery, to the rows of silent, waiting faces. "And I cannot, in good conscience, ask them to wait another hour, not when we have the power to act now." A ripple ran through the chamber, subtle but unmistakable. Heads turned, whispers died on lips, the spell of delay beginning to break. JD's heart quickened, not with triumph, but with hope. Fragile still, but real. He watched as the senator straightened, his voice gaining strength. "I may not agree with every word of the bill as it stands. I may have wished for more time. But some moments call us to act, not because the path is perfect, but because waiting any longer would be the greater wrong. Tonight, this is such a moment." The words fell into the chamber like kindling on a spark, small at first, but enough. JD saw the shift in posture, the change in eyes. Colleagues who had moments before clutched at the safety of delay now hesitated, rethinking. Even Warren turned, her face thoughtful, her eyes lingering on the senator who had, with quiet courage, chosen the harder road. The presiding officer, sensing the tide turning, hesitated in his preparation to recognize the motion. The gallery remained standing, a silent force that seemed to lend strength to every heart now bending toward action. Outside, the storm pounded the windows. But within these walls, the storm of indecision began to quiet, replaced by the gathering of resolve. JD drew a breath, feeling for the first time that the night might yet turn. That unity, fragile, fleeting, but powerful, could be forged from this crucible. The senator's words had done what speeches had not, what arguments had failed to achieve. He had reminded them all that sometimes courage comes not in great declarations, but in small, unexpected stands that show others the way forward. And as the chamber shifted, as the storm raged on, JD knew the battle was not over, but a spark had caught, and now it was theirs to fan into something that could warm a waiting nation. The chamber had shifted, the spark of unity flickering, fragile but real in the still charged air. The senator's unexpected stand had cracked the ice of delay, but JD knew the moment was not yet won. The weight of indecision still clung to the room, heavy as the storm pressing against the ancient windows. JD remained standing, steadying himself, drawing in the cold air of the chamber like fuel for what must come next. He felt every eye upon him, not just of those seated at polished desks, but of those in the gallery above, and of history itself, waiting to record what would be said. Outside, the wind roared louder, rattling the glass as if demanding that the night's truth be spoken at last. JD's voice, when it came, was soft, so soft that at first it seemed the storm might swallow it whole. But the chamber was silent, and so his words carried, unchallenged, into every corner of the vast space. "A boy asked me once, 'Do we have a home, sir?'" JD's gaze was distant for a moment, as if seeing again the face that had asked him that question, small, thin, eyes too old for their years. It was at a food bank just before Christmas. He stood in a coat too big for him, clutching a can of soup like it was treasure. And that's what he wanted to know. Not what bills were passing, not what votes were cast. Just, did he have a home? His voice trembled on the last word, the memory raw, too near the surface to be tamed by practiced rhetoric. He paused, drawing a slow breath, steadying himself as the chamber remained still, the storm's wail outside now seeming to underscore every syllable. "What could I say?" JD asked, not of the chamber, but of himself, of the storm, of the silent faces watching from above. Could I promise him that Washington would fix it? That votes would come in time? That balance would feed him? That delay would warm him? I couldn't, because that night, like tonight, all I had was the hope that someone, anyone, would find the courage to act. His eyes swept the room, meeting gaze after gaze, searching for that courage. He saw senators shift in their seats, saw shoulders straighten, saw some lower their heads, unable to meet the weight of what his words demanded. That boy didn't care about amendments or motions. He cared about whether he would have a place to sleep that night that wasn't the back of a car. He cared about whether his mother would stop crying when she thought he wasn't looking. And tonight, there are thousands like him, waiting, hoping, trusting that we will not let them down. The storm outside seemed to rise with his words, the wind lashing at the windows as if in applause or warning. J.D.'s voice, though trembling still, grew stronger, forged in the fire of what must be said. We can answer that boy tonight. We can tell him that yes, he has a home because we had the courage to give him one. Or we can delay and let the storm answer for us. The chamber remained silent, gripped by the truth that filled it now. Not the truth of policy, but of conscience. And as J.D. stood there, the storm at his back, the boy's question echoed not just through the room, but through every heart that heard it. The chamber remained silent in the wake of J.D.'s words, the memory of that boy's question hanging in the air like the storm outside, unavoidable, undeniable. J.D.'s voice had fallen quiet, but the echo of his plea lingered, refusing to be forgotten. The storm beyond the windows lashed against the glass, as if determined to drive the weight of his truth deeper into the hearts of those who had heard it. For a long moment, Warren did not move. She remained seated, hands clasped tightly on the desk before her, as though bracing herself against the pull of what had just been spoken. Her eyes were lowered, fixed on nothing, seeing instead memories long buried beneath years of policy battles and carefully measured words. The chamber waited, not for argument now, but for something more. And at last, Warren rose, slowly, as if the night's burden pressed upon her shoulders as surely as it did upon J.D.'s. When she spoke, her voice was softer than it had been all evening, the polished certainty stripped away by the rawness of the moment. "When I was a girl," she began, the words slow, as if drawn from a place she had not visited in years. "My father lost his job. I remember the look on his face when he came home that day, like he'd failed us somehow, even though it wasn't his fault." Her gaze lifted, and for the first time, it was not the seasoned senator who looked out at the chamber, but the daughter who had once stood in a kitchen, too quiet, watching a mother try to stretch pennies into meals. "I remember my mother crying in the next room, trying to figure out how to pay the bills, how to keep us in the house. And I remember thinking, even as a child, how unfair it was that good people could do everything right and still fall." The room seemed to draw closer around her, the storm's howl softening in deference to the quiet truth she offered now. Warren's hands trembled slightly where they rested on the desk, her voice unsteady but unwavering. "That's why I fought so hard to get the details right, because I know what it means when we get it wrong. I know what it costs. And I never wanted another family to go through that because we rushed, because we didn't think through the consequences." She paused, her breath uneven, her eyes glistening. "But maybe—" The word hung there, fragile, suspended between caution and compassion. "Maybe tonight, the greater risk is waiting too long." It was a rare moment on the Senate floor. Not a clash of ideas, not a contest of wills, but the meeting of two truths, both born of hardship, both rooted in the same soil of care. The divide between J.D. and Warren, so stark only hours ago, seemed for a heartbeat to narrow, not erased, but bridged by the shared humanity neither could deny. Around them, the chamber was silent still, the storm outside pressing against the glass, waiting. And in that quiet, in that fragile unity, the night seemed to hold its breath, as if the next choice might finally turn the tide. The chamber remained steeped in the quiet that followed Warren's words, a quiet unlike any that had settled over the Senate that night. Not the silence of indecision, nor of procedural pause, but of something deeper. It was the silence that came when argument gave way to truth, when hearts, long shielded by habit and politics, found themselves bare beneath the weight of shared humanity. The storm outside seemed, for a breath, to ease its assault on the windows, as if waiting, like the nation beyond, to see what would come next. JD stood where he had been, watching Warren with a gaze not of victory, but of respect. He had not sought to defeat her, nor she him. They had both laid their truce before the chamber, and now it was for the others to decide what kind of night this would be. The shift began slowly, as such shifts often do. A senator at the far edge of the chamber, long regarded as cautious to a fault, leaned forward, his hands folded, his eyes thoughtful. Another, who had earlier signaled support for delay, glanced toward the gallery, toward the faces that still stood in silent plea, and then toward JD, as if weighing not just the words that had been spoken, but the cost of ignoring them. JD could see it, the small changes in posture, in expression, the telltale signs of minds reconsidering, of hearts remembering. The chamber's stillness was no longer that of hesitation. It was the quiet before a choice. And so he spoke once more, his voice low but strong, the kind of strength that comes not from defiance, but from deep conviction. Tonight, history watches us. The words filled the space, steady as the heartbeat of the nation that waited beyond these walls. It will not remember our motions or amendments. It will not remember who spoke the longest or argued the hardest. It will remember only this. Did we find the courage to act when it mattered most? He let the words settle. Let them become part of the night, part of the storm, part of the very air they breathed. His gaze swept the room, not challenging, not demanding, but inviting. Inviting them to join him, to meet this moment not with fear, but with the strength that came from knowing they had done what was right. Outside, as if answering his call, the wind rose once more. But this time, it felt different. No longer the howl of a storm that threatened to tear them down, but the voice of a storm that urged them forward. Within the chamber, the motion to delay, once so close to certain, now seemed to wither beneath the quiet gathering of resolve. One by one, key senators began to rise, signaling in their stillness, in their nods, in their steadying breath, that they had chosen. The tide had turned, not in a roar, but in the steady swell of conscience finding its voice. And as JD lowered his gaze, as the chamber prepared at last to move beyond debate and toward decision, the storm outside bore witness, carrying his words into the night. Let it remember our courage. The chamber was a breath held tight, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from the weight of what is about to unfold. JD stood at his desk, his hands resting lightly on the worn wood, feeling the history etched into its surface. The storm outside beat against the windows, as if it too demanded to witness what would happen next. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. The tide of hesitation had turned, replaced by resolve that crackled in the air like static before lightning. The presiding officer rose, his voice steady but softer than usual, as though even he felt the gravity of what the chamber was about to do. The clerk will call the roll. The first name echoed in the vast space, and with it came the first answer. "Aye." The word rang out, sharp and clear, and it seemed to reverberate through the chamber like a struck bell, each syllable heavier than it should have been. JD's heart pounded in rhythm with the vote, each declaration of support a drumbeat that pushed back the night's long shadow. The clerk continued, name after name, and with each came a word that seemed louder, more final. "Nay." That too echoed, but where the ayes rang like hope, the nays fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through the room, ripples through the faces, watching from above, ripples through JD's own resolve. He kept his eyes forward, his breath even, though every muscle in his body tensed with the strain of waiting, listening, willing the chamber toward the future that now stood so close. Each vote was a moment carved into stone, a choice that would be remembered long after the storm had passed, long after these walls had gone silent again. The gallery remained standing, their silent protest now a silent prayer. Eyes glistened, hands clenched, as they hung on every word, as if their lives balanced on the blade of each syllable spoken. And perhaps, JD thought, they did. Outside, the storm's fury grew, as if determined to test the chamber's courage one last time. The wind howling with a voice that seemed to demand, "Will you act?" "Aye." "Nay." The roll call continued, each name, each answer louder in JD's ears than the storm itself. He could feel his pulse in his temples, feel the weight of every second that passed, feel the eyes of those who waited for this chamber's choice. Not just those in the gallery, but the thousands beyond, unseen but no less present in this room tonight. And then came the names that mattered most, the names of those whose decisions would tip the scale, whose courage or caution would decide whether the night ended in action or retreat. One by one they spoke. "I." The word hit the air like thunder, and JD felt the shift, felt the balance move at last. Another. "I." And another. The path was clearing, the storm inside the chamber breaking even as the storm outside raged on. JD drew a slow, steadying breath as the final names approached. His hands loosened their grip on the desk. Whatever came now, he knew the chamber had found its voice. And as the last vote was called, as the final word echoed through the hall, the storm beyond bore witness to a choice that would not be forgotten. The final word of the roll call echoed through the chamber, the storm outside seeming, for that instant, to pause its furious assault as if to listen. The presiding officer's voice, clear but heavy with the weight of the night, delivered what all had waited for. "The motion passes. The American Workers' Relief Act is approved." For a breath, the chamber remained frozen in place, as if no one dared move. No one dared break the spell of history being written. And then, from the gallery, from the rows of silent witnesses who had borne the night storm with nothing but hope in their eyes, came the sound that would mark the true victory of that moment. It was not a cheer. It was not applause. It was the sound of a mother's sob, but not the grief-stricken sob that had shattered the chamber earlier. This was different. This was the sob of relief too deep for words, of a burden finally eased after carrying it too long. Her hands clasped tightly at her chest, her body trembling as tears streamed down her face, tears that washed away hours of fear, days of uncertainty, months of quiet desperation. JD saw her, and in that instant, the weight of the night crashed over him. His knees felt weak, his breath caught in his throat, and he lowered his head, not in weariness, but in quiet, overwhelming gratitude. His eyes stung with tears of his own, and he let them come, unashamed as the storm outside resumed its song. But somehow, its voice seemed less fierce now, as if even nature recognized the chamber's choice. The gallery remained standing, but now their silent protest had become a silent thank you. Faces turned toward the senators below, not with judgment, but with quiet appreciation. Some hands covered mouths to stifle sobs of their own. Some wiped tears away with worn sleeves, but all bore the mark of a hope restored, if only for this night. And slowly, hesitantly at first, the chamber itself responded. The quiet that had held so long gave way to soft applause, a ripple of sound that spread like warmth through the cold marble hall. It was not the applause of victory in battle, not the celebration of triumph over an opponent. It was the applause of a shared moment of decency, of duty fulfilled, of courage found at the edge of fear. JD straightened, drawing in a steady breath, feeling the applause not as praise for himself, but as a release of all that the night had held. He glanced toward Warren, saw her nod, her eyes moist, her face no longer one of opposition, but of understanding. They had stood on different shores at the start, but tonight they had met in the same place, in service of those who had no voice but the one given to them in that chamber. The storm outside rattled the windows once more, but its fury seemed spent. Inside, the chamber breathed again, and with it, a nation that had waited in the dark for news that, at last, the storm within had passed. The storm outside softened as if the night itself had exhaled at last, releasing the tension it had carried alongside the chamber. Within those marble walls, the quiet applause faded, leaving behind a stillness that no longer felt heavy with indecision, but filled with the quiet relief of a duty fulfilled. JD remained at his desk for a long moment, his head slightly bowed, listening not to the storm now, but to the heartbeat of a nation that, at last, could sleep with a little more hope. News of the night's decision spread swiftly, as though carried by the wind itself. Headlines blazed across his screens before dawn had touched the horizon, bold words framed in banners of relief and wonder. One night, one cry, one bill that changed everything. Senate acts in midnight storm, aid approved for America's forgotten. Courage breaks through, relief on the way for thousands. Across the country, in towns still dark with winter's grip, families woke to hear what had happened while they slept. In kitchens and living rooms, radios murmured of the bill's passage, of the storm that had battered the Capitol, of the mother's tears that had moved a chamber to act. In shelters and cars and too cold apartments, the news was met with quiet tears, with clasped hands, with whispered thanks. Not for any one person, but for the simple fact that, for once, government had heard the cry of its people and answered. Reporters called for comment, cameras waited for statements, but JD declined the stage. The chamber's press gallery, expectant, found only a man standing in the soft light of dawn, breaking through the storm's end. When at last he spoke, his words were few, and they carried the humility that had shaped the night. "Tonight wasn't about me," JD said, his voice steady but low, meant more for those who had stood watching from above than for the headlines that would follow. "It was about us, all of us, and the courage we found when it mattered most." The cameras captured the moment, but no grand speech followed, no self-congratulation, no claim to victory. JD turned from the podium, his steps slow but sure, his heart full, his mind already on the work that would follow. Because one night's courage was not enough to heal all that had been broken. But it was a start, and sometimes that was everything. Outside, the first rays of morning light touched the Capitol's dome, casting it in gold against the retreating storm clouds. The building, battered by wind and ice through the long night, now stood quiet and strong, a symbol not of perfection, but of perseverance. JD paused at the doors, glancing back once, not at the chamber, but at the gallery where a few still stood, lingering in the aftermath of history. He nodded to them, a silent promise that the night's work was only the beginning. And as he stepped out into the cold morning air, the wind gentler now carrying with it the scent of earth and promise, America began to awaken, not just from sleep but from the long night of waiting, ready at last to begin again. The storm had finally spent itself. The wind which had howled through the night with a voice like grief had fallen quiet. The heavy clouds that had cloaked the city began to part, their ragged edges glowing as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. And as the light touched the Capitol, it turned the battered dome to gold, the soft shimmer of morning casting aside the night's darkness, as if washing the building clean of all that had weighed upon it. The great marble steps, slick with melted ice, glistened in the new day's light. JD stood at the top for a moment, breathing in the cold, clean air. His shoulders felt heavy with exhaustion, but his heart was light in a way he had not felt for many months. The work ahead would be hard. He knew that. One bill would not heal all that was broken. But the night had shown what was possible when courage outweighed caution, when the people's cry was louder than the storm. He started down the steps, his boots striking softly on the wet stone. There was no applause now, no cameras crowding close. The reporters had long since turned their attention to their deadlines, their headlines already set. The nation was only just beginning to stir, but here and there, on the plaza below, a few figures waited: Capitol staff, night guards, workers beginning their day. And as JD passed, they greeted him not with words but with quiet nods of respect. Small gestures, but meaningful, the kind that said more than speeches ever could. JD met their eyes briefly, nodded in return, and kept walking. The cold morning air bit at his face, but he welcomed it. It reminded him that he was alive, that the storm had not won. Above him, the dome gleamed brighter with each passing minute, the gold light spreading, reaching out to the city that lay beyond. Streets that had been empty, buried in snowdrifts, now began to stir as people emerged, blinking against the dawn, unaware at first of all that it happened while they slept. JD paused once more at the base of the steps, turning back to look at the Capitol, at the building that had stood firm against the storm's assault, just as its people had stood firm in the face of fear and indecision. The work of that night was done, but the work of rebuilding, of restoring faith, of answering the next cry for help, was only just beginning. He took a slow breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and then he turned toward the day, ready to meet it, ready to walk whatever road lay ahead. The morning sun climbed higher, casting its soft glow beyond the Capitol dome, out across the streets where life stirred again, and farther still to towns and cities that had watched the storm's fury from afar. In a small school miles from the Capitol, in a modest classroom where the windows still rattled from the night's passing wind, the echoes of the night's courage reached ears eager to understand what it meant to lead. The civics teacher stood at the front of the room, the usual morning lesson set aside. A video clip played on the screen. JD's voice, steady but worn from the weight of the long night, filled the space. Tonight wasn't about me. It was about us. All of us. And the courage we found when it mattered most. The students sat in quiet attention, their notebooks forgotten, their pencils stilled. The room, often restless at this hour, seemed to lean forward, drawn in by the sincerity of words that needed no embellishment. The teacher paused the video, letting the last syllables settle like dust after a storm, and glanced over the faces before him. Some thoughtful, some uncertain, all touched by the gravity of what they'd heard. From the back of the room came a voice, soft but sure, as if the question had formed without the speakers knowing it. Could I ever stand like that? The boy who spoke was small for his age, his voice edged with the mix of doubt and hope that marked a young heart reaching for something larger than itself. The teacher smiled, not the kind of smile that answers with ease, but the kind that honored the weight of the question. He stepped away from the screen, folding his hands loosely in front of him. "That's what courage looks like," he said quietly. "And yes, you could. Courage doesn't belong to senators or heroes in books. It belongs to anyone who chooses it when the moment calls." Outside the classroom window, the storm's remnants glistened on the bare branches, the morning light making the ice sparkle like glass. Inside, the students sat a little straighter, as if the night's example had, in some small way, taken root in them too. And as the teacher turned to restart the clip, the room filled once more with the voice of a man who had answered that call, and in doing so, reminded a nation what courage could look like. Weeks passed, and the storm that had gripped the Capitol became a memory, spoken of in headlines, retold in classrooms, and felt in the quiet gratitude of those whose lives had been touched by the night's decision. The aid had begun to flow, not as fast as hope had wished, but enough to make a difference. In towns where factories had once stood silent, machines hummed to life again, and the steady rhythm of work replaced the silence of despair. JD arrived at one of those places on a cold, clear morning. The factory gates, long chains shut, now swung open as workers filed in, their faces marked by hard years but brightened by the promise of a future regained. JD shook their hands one by one, not as a senator greeting constituents, but as a man grateful for the chance to look them in the eye, to see that the night's courage had become more than words. Among them was a boy no older than 10, bundled in a coat 2 sizes too large, his boots dusted with frost. He approached shyly, his gaze lifting to meet JD's. Without a word at first, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around JD's waist in a quick, fierce hug. His voice, small but certain, carried more weight than any speech could have. "Sir, we have a home again." JD's breath caught, and for a long moment, he had no words. He looked up toward the flag that flew over the factory, its fabric stirring gently in the morning breeze, the red, white, and blue bright against the pale winter sky. "Storms will come," JD thought, the boy's voice echoing in his heart. "But so will those who stand." This story reminds us that true leadership is not about titles or power, but about standing firm when it matters most. JD's courage and the quiet strength of those he served show how a single night can shape a nation's future. In times of storm, it's the small acts of conscience that light the way forward. What would courage look like for you if your moment came? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.